And we're going to turn now, though, to our big read this week, which is all about the great wealth transfer, quote unquote. It's a phrase I'm sure many listeners will have heard about. It's a phrase that's been doing the rounds for a number of years now, but I think it's fair to say that transfer is now happening, i.e. talking about the passing of money between generations from the baby boomers, the silent generation, which is the generation before the baby boomers, down to millennials and Gen Z and what have you. Val, can you give us a bit more context, first of all, as to our thinking behind the writing of this piece?
Yeah, sure. So it's this idea that a record amount of money is in the hands of older generations, and they're getting older and they're going to start passing down that money. And the questions are around, how you do it, both from a perspective of, helping your children or potentially grandchildren from a financial perspective, and then from the point of view of saving on inheritance tax, which is the thing that people who have a bit more money aside are very much thinking about. And then on the other side, from a practical perspective, what does giving big amounts of money to younger people mean, and what is the best way to go about it? So that's what roughly we were thinking when looking at the piece.
The fundamental trade-off here is, as you say in the story, very much about having money yourself on hand versus if you're someone who wants to or is concerned about inheritance tax and wanting to think about how to pass that on most effectively. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, definitely. So basically the question is, do you want to give money in your lifetime or do you want to give money in your will? And giving money in your lifetime has some obvious advantages. So, you get to help your children sooner. So potentially when they need it more, for example, when they're trying to get on the property ladder, and then potentially you save on inheritance tax. The reason being that with gifting, there are a number of options and allowances, but the most simple way is that after you give whatever amount you want to give, and after 7 years that is out of your estate, so inheritance tax does no longer apply. Now, so that means that you need to live for 7 years after making the gift. So you need to make it relatively soon so you can be fairly confident that the strategy is going to work. And obviously, the downside of that is that once the gift is made, it's made. So you no longer have access to the money. So you kind of have to ask yourself whether you might need it later in life. And then you have to ask yourself whether you're okay with the idea that, this money is going to be managed by your descendants and the decisions are going to be in their hands.
Speaking of needing money, one thing a lot of readers of the IC or a lot of people in general are concerned about nowadays are care costs. We all know the extent of those costs, how much they are. There can be eye-watering figures in many ways, or in most ways, really, to the extent that even people with a lot of money are concerned about having enough for care fees and making sure they don't run out in later life. Is there an argument, though, that almost that maybe this is just being devil's advocate, but that concern has gone too far the other way and people are now too concerned about having too much money for that stage of life? Sorry to interrupt. Just in the context of someone with a large amount of money already, of course, we're talking about here.
Yeah. That's definitely it. It's such a broad range, isn't it? It's a massive concern. And for the vast, vast majority of people, they are incredibly expensive and a big problem. And a lot of people are going to have to sell their homes to fund care fees. So, that is not in doubt. But advisors do speak about, having almost the opposite problem with some people. And that's, I think, because the topic is discussed so much and because it's quite difficult to put a figure on, because you're like, well, I might or may not need it. I don't know how long I'm going to need it for. So it can potentially add up to very, very big figures. And for some people, it does. However, it is also true that, on average, unfortunately, people are not in a care home for very long. I think the average is around 2 to 4 years. And then it's quite rare that both members of a couple, both spouses, would need care at the same time or together anyway. Usually it happens after the first one has passed away. So basically the conversation there is about, people who have really a lot of money sometimes are really concerned about care fees. And we do get them sometimes in the portfolio clinic section of the magazine. And sometimes they write in and they've got, a few millions and they're like worried about care fees. So obviously they're really, really expensive. But for some people making a sort of financial plan and putting some figures on this problem, then it can allow them to give more money in their lifetime and, enjoy their money as well.
Which is very important as well. Talking about gifting, the allowance is a case of use it or lose it to a certain extent, given, well, there's the 7-year clock and given there's certain amounts you can do each year, all of which is detailed in the piece. Also, maybe, I'm slightly loath to talk about this, but given there is a budget coming down the line, gifting, as with virtually everything in relation to personal finance, has been one area where there's speculation about changes there. So maybe that's something people should consider. Equally, you don't really want to be making financial plans based on speculation.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's something that it is worth starting to think about early anyway, because sometimes people leave it quite late, and then depending on the life expectancy, it can be a bit difficult to sort of come up with a IHT strategy if you are really old. But yes, so gifting allowances basically, so there's an annual allowance which is £3,000, which can be carried forward for a year. But so you can use the previous years basically. But roughly speaking, it is a case of use it or lose it. So, it's a 7 years rule. If you wait the following year, you're going to have to wait for 7 years. And so it's going to be after. And there is the budget. There has been, as you say, a lot of speculation. We don't know what is going to happen. Certainly, gifting is an area that has been flagged as something that might be changed. Many other areas have been flagged. But I guess generally speaking, it's worth getting started early. And then maybe you also have the advantage that you get started with relatively small amounts. And then you can sort of, you have the time to talk to your children or grandchildren about how you want to arrange the finances in the future, about the level of giving you want to do. You can see how they use the money. So it's just kind of like worth getting started, basically.
It might be one situation where the speculation is actually helpful in that regard. When people consider passing on the money, sometimes the concern people have is, are my children, grandchildren ready for this money? However much money it is, sometimes they might not have much faith in their children's abilities in some way. So what kind of things do we tend to see here, and what can people do to reassure themselves, shall we say, about these things?
Yeah, it's something I spent a bit of time on in the piece because it's quite an interesting, sometimes family dynamic. I think sometimes, certainly advisors were saying that sometimes, you get people kind of not realizing that their children have grown up and are probably at this point quite good with money. They're not as young. The children themselves are not as young anymore. And there's also the fact that, someone younger than you might want to do things a bit differently, but that might not necessarily mean that the way they want to do it is bad. Talking about, for example, the way the money is invested, the investment approach, concerns about sustainability is something we mentioned in the piece. So there is an element perhaps of, talking to your children and kind of like try and figure out how they want to approach this, what they would do with the money if they had it. And you might be surprised to an extent by maybe how mature these people are, because, time goes quick. But other than that, if, those concerns are kind of, they just stand and you want to keep a level of control over the money after having given it away. There are a couple of options, although, of course, a straightforward lifetime giving, which is absolute and cannot be reversed, is the easiest. Is the easiest way of going about this. But there are a couple of options. First of all, you can try for a sort of informal agreement or arrangement where you kind of get your children to agree to let you keep an eye on, for example, the investments. Which might be it might be good if you're an expert DIY investor, like many of our readers are, and then sometimes the children are not. So you can kind of lend a hand with your expertise as well. So that's one option. And otherwise, for more formal options there, you can have a look at trusts, and we have some information on those in the piece, although obviously they are a more complicated, potentially less tax efficient, and potentially a bit more expensive arrangement.
One other thing it might be interesting to talk about is how to divide money fairly between different children, because I imagine that could be an issue too as well, depending on if people are in different stages of their life, different ages, things like that. It can be a tricky thing to deal with.
Yeah, definitely. It really depends because, as you say, you can have children of different ages. You can have children with different careers. You can have quite simply, one child may have like three grandchildren, and the other one may only have one. So at which point, there are all these questions around how you split the money. Some things to keep in mind. So maybe you start with, splitting equally as a starting point, but then you look at the other things and you consider whether you need to do something a little different. One thing to keep in mind is the effect of inflation. So especially if there is an age gap between the children, or if life circumstances just mean that you are going to end up giving one of the children money first and the other one maybe a bit later. Just, consider that giving the same figure, if a few years have passed in the meantime, will not have the same value, because obviously inflation erodes the value of money. So, if you give £50,000 now, or if you give it in 3 years, it's not the same amount of money. So something to keep in mind. One option there is to, make those two gifts at the same time. But if the other person is not ready to receive it yet, you can just put it in an investment account for that person, so the money gets a chance to grow, but it's already been put aside in a way, which can be very effective if, for example, we are talking about minors. Um, and then the other thing you can do, which sometimes people do, is that if they offer more support during their lifetime to one of the children for whatever reason, then they can leave a bit more of their estate in the will to the other one. But yeah, I guess the only thing to point out in all of these situations is that you kind of need to make clear to your children what you intend to do, especially in your will, and why you intend to do it. Because obviously, if they perceive it as unfair, and then you're no longer there to explain why you've done it, it can create conflicts, it can create complications, and ideally you want to avoid that. So yeah, sometimes it's a bit of a tricky conversation to have, because it's not something people like to think or talk about, but it's very important to get it done.
Mhm. Well, all this information is in the article. So if you're someone thinking of gifting, or if you're someone who thinks you might be gifted some money and want to take the perhaps bold step of putting this article in front of your elders, speaking of tricky conversations, that might be one, do take a look at the feature, which is online and in print now.